Welcome, everyone, to the Asian American Unity Coalition's 15th podcast in our continuing monthly series, Building Our Collective American Dream. I'm Jack Hanna, board member and public policy and advocacy chair for AAUC. This month, fellow board member Rajiv Singh interviews Raymond Partalon, National Field Director of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote, APIA Vote. We learned that Raymond is a person of many talents, not only with his expertise with field organizing at APIA Vote, but also his political knowledge and efforts involving data, working with campaigns, political action committees, and the reapportionment process. In addition, Rajiv astutely discovered another unique and award-winning skill Raymond has that further exemplified the unique talents and advocacy he brings to the Asian American community. Let us now join Rajiv and Raymond for an interview that I found particularly interesting as to his work with the APIA Vote organization and the American political system's challenges and opportunities for Asian America.
Hello, Raymond.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast today. I'm super excited about our discussion.
Wonderful. The pleasure is ours. I have to confess that I did not know that you are a Grammy Award winner artist.
Yeah, it actually came at a really big surprise to me. A huge part of who I am as a person is the fact that I am formerly undocumented. A couple of years ago, I was approached about an opportunity to participate in a jazz album. So I'm actually a musician. I have been playing the violin for almost 20 years. I also enjoy singing and playing the guitar. And I was invited to participate in this project where I would sing in the chorus of this jazz album, but also share my immigrant story. And so I did this, and all of a sudden I started getting messages like, hey, our album is nominated for a Grammy Award. And I was, wow, that's really cool. Would have never expected that. And then when we learned that we had actually won 3 Grammy Awards for that jazz album, it was just out of this world and completely unexpected. For the listeners out there, the name of the album is American Dreamers, Voices of Hope, Music of Freedom. And the album, as I mentioned, is a jazz album, and interspersed in between a number of the tracks are stories, undocumented young people who live here in the United States and the kinds of challenges that they've had to face.
Wonderful story. We would definitely want to listen to it. Tell us a little bit about what APIA Vote, your role as field director, what does that mean, and how do you serve? Who do you serve?
APIA Vote is an acronym that stands for Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. And we are the nation's leading nonpartisan nonprofit that is dedicated to engaging, educating, and empowering Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in order to strengthen their voices and create impact. For 15 years, our action-driven organization has led national initiatives to ensure that APIs are represented and heard. And our work specifically focuses on, 1, getting APIs registered and out to vote, and protecting the freedom to vote so that communities can advocate for the issues that are important to them. For example, the issue that is important to me is immigration reform. And I'm sure we'll get into this later on in our conversation, but just like any other racial or ethnic community, Rajiv, our community is focused on and cares about the same kinds of issues that every American cares about, like the economy and taxes, healthcare, etc. We also focus on investing in grassroots organizations across the nation, connecting them with expertise and resources to effectively engage with people of diverse ages, backgrounds, and languages at the national, regional, and local level. And we also expand and support policies that help APIs build collective power and gain recognition as a growing national force. So for me specifically, as the National Field Director, I serve on our organization's senior management team. And together we design and implement impactful and effective field programs with our partners in 28 states all around the country. And when we say field programs, we mean the process of developing tactics that have been research tested to engage and encourage members to recognize the importance of voting in every election. And some of those tactics include phone banking, text banking, direct mail, legislative visits, anything that we can do to ensure that our community is seen and heard in the decision-making processes that affect our everyday lives.
Raymond, when we talk about a democracy as vibrant as the United States, and when we talk about voter engagement or encouragement to vote, the obvious question becomes, well, why do we not have our citizens engaged in the process? Tell us, what are the roadblocks of why Asian Americans do not engage in the civic process as much as you would expect them to, given the challenges they have faced in not far distant history, but very recent?
That's a really good question, Rajiv. So I think one of the number one challenges that we as a community face when it comes to participating in our civic processes is access. The fact of the matter is, according to US Census data, about 1/3, one out of every 3 members of the Asian American community is what we call limited English proficient. And unless a jurisdiction, that is a county or a state, a city, is covered under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which was a seminal piece of legislation passed and signed into law in the 1960s, then all election-related materials, including ballots, announcements, posters, flyers, are only provided in the English language. And so having that information only available in a language that people are not 100% comfortable with or familiar with is a barrier that many in our community face. And that's where APIA Vote steps in. We are committed to ensuring that the resources that we provide to the community is accessible, that they're provided in language when possible. We, as an organization, along with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, a close partner of ours, we co-coordinate and implement a multilingual voter protection hotline that can be reached at 1-888-API-VOTE. And assistance is available in English, Mandarin, Cantonese, Korean, Vietnamese, Tagalog, my native language, Hindi, Urdu, and Bengali. So language access, Rajiv, definitely is one of those barriers, but our community members report that they're just too busy to vote, that voting is not convenient for them. And to a lesser extent, there is also a degree of apathy. Members of our community who feel like votes are not impactful, that their one singular vote will not make a huge difference in American system. So to address some of those challenges, APIA Vote has implemented a comprehensive voting rights advocacy strategy, which includes expanding access to the ballot and vote by mail options. In 2020, Rajiv, we found that almost 75% of Asian American voters who cast the ballot in the 2020 election cast the ballot either early or by mail. That is a combination of the fact that we were in the middle of a global pandemic, but also voting by mail and having the opportunity to vote early in person is just convenient. And we as Asian Americans, we enjoy convenience, right? We want the process to be as easy as possible for us. And at the same time, following the 2020 election, states across the country have begun to introduce and implement voter suppression measures that would curtail or reduce the opportunity of communities to vote early in person or by mail, regardless of the method of voting. Asian American voter turnout has increased about 47% from 2016 into 2020. And that is remarkable. In the 2020 election, APIs turned out to vote at record-breaking levels, increasing turnout by more than any other racial or ethnic group compared to 2016. So we were standouts as a community. And API voter turnout also climbed higher than any other racial group in several key battleground states like Georgia and Arizona. One thing that I always like to talk about is the fact that in Georgia, which is my home state, Asian American voters cast about 140,000 ballots in 2020. Meanwhile, President Biden won the state and its 13 electoral votes by just 13,000 ballots. And so you can see that Asian American voter turnout as a whole completely overshadowed the margin of victory. And this is an indicator of our growing electoral power as a community. So if you are listening to this and you believe that your vote does not matter, just remember that elections are won, in many cases, just dozens or hundreds of votes. And so it is so important for you to get out to vote in every single election. Doesn't matter if it's a presidential, if it's a midterm like this year, or even just your local municipal election where you'll be electing your city council members and your mayors.
You briefly talked about the US Census, the latest one in 2020. As a field director, what catches your eye in that data? Tell us a little bit about what surprised you, especially in context of AAPI.
Our community has been one of the most undercounted communities among all major racial groups. And so we set out to ensure that every single person in our community, regardless of age, regardless of citizenship status, is counted. So we undertook a major outreach campaign to encourage participation in the 2020 census, which found that AAPIs continue to be among the fastest growing populations in the entire country. Asian Americans are growing by double-digit rates in 49 states and the District of Columbia, and Pacific Islander communities are similarly growing by double digits in 48 states and DC. Thanks to that data and thanks to the numbers that we now have access to, we have successfully built a case for why it is so important for candidates for public office and current sitting elected officials, foundations, other stakeholders in the community to pay attention to us as a community. Because without the support of Asian American and Pacific Islander voters, candidates are hard pressed to find victory in their races. And so just analyzing the census data, we would urge candidates and elected officials to recognize our growing power and to pay attention to our needs, which is why after the 2020 census, Rajiv, we shifted gears, we shifted our priorities, and we focused a great deal of our time and energy into advocating in the 2021-2022 redistricting process. So not only have we now counted every single member of our community, we now are urging our community members to play an important role in the redistricting processes that are happening around their communities, a process that will determine how district lines are going to be drawn and in effect for the next 10 years. So something we always like to say is elected officials shouldn't be able to pick their voters. Voters should be able to pick their elected officials. And I'm happy to say that our community participated in the redistricting process in ways like they have never before.
Help us a little bit more about this perennial redistricting that in a way shows how vibrant we are. It acknowledges the change of demographics that we are experiencing as a nation. How do we deal with this redistricting process more gracefully?
First, let me talk a little bit about the redistricting process and what it is for all the listeners out there, because redistricting is a little bit of an obscure kind of issue. Redistricting happens every 10 years and it follows the US Census. So if we have the US Census in 2020, the redistricting process will occur in 2021 and in some places stretch into 2022. But essentially, after everyone in the country has been counted, now states and local governmental bodies like counties and cities now have the responsibility of reapportionment. So that is related to redistricting. Reapportionment is when states get assigned a number of seats in the United States Congress based on their population. And the reason that happens is because the United States Constitution calls for exactly 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives. And that 435 is divvied up amongst the states depending on their population. So that happens first. After that, we've got redistricting. And that is when these government actors are tasked with the responsibility of redrawing the district lines to take into account where the growth in communities and where the decline in communities has occurred. And so historically, this process has been dominated by people who have historically been in power. These are elected officials, political parties, et cetera, et cetera. And it has not historically taken into account the needs of our community. And when I say our community, I don't mean specifically the Asian American or Pacific Islander community, but just people as a whole, regular people like you and me. And this year, we as an organization, along with a coalition of other great national organizations, have really set out to make the redistricting process about us as a community, as Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, African Americans, Latinx Americans. Fairness and equity have to be at the center of this process. And that means that when elected officials and redistricting commissions draw these district lines, they have to recognize that they serve us as a community. And when that happens, it's important that they put aside all of their self-interest in winning re-election or winning greater partisan power for their particular political party. And they truly center this process on the community. And this is where gerrymandering comes into play. Historically, elected officials have engaged in partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. And that is something that we as an organization, along with our coalition partners, have tried to truly combat in this redistricting.
So, as a voter and as an active civic member, part of various coalitions, how can I participate in the process of redistricting? One way I see that happening is raising the awareness about redistricting, giving people a heads up that it is about to happen, bringing them to redistricting commissions to express their views on how the line should be drawn. Is there something else that we are not doing that we should be doing?
There are a number of areas that the API vote is working with to support their local redistricting efforts. We would encourage community members to show up to hearings, to testify as to their experience on about where the biggest growth has been in terms of geographic area and their ethnic community, but also to work with people like API vote and our partners who are willing to provide technical assistance in the drawing of community of interest maps. Because when it comes down to it, the redistricting process, it's about representation, and a huge component of that is the presentation and the drawing of maps to determine where district lines should be. And so we as an organization, along with our partners, have the capacity to assist people in the drawing of those maps in order to present ultimately to the redistricting commissions and the legislatures who are approving these district maps to show them where we are as a community.
And having heard you talk about a lot of data, my suspicion is that you're not just relying on the census data, but somehow collect your own data from the field. I'm very curious to know what sort of data you have access to. How do you collect it? What assistance can organizations like AAUC provide you in collecting that data, or in any other manner?
So the United States Census data is definitely one of the most reliable sources of data that we use. Another source of data, and this is also administered by the U.S. Census Bureau, is the American Community Survey. This is single-handedly the best source of disaggregated data by ethnicity that we have. And we use the American Community Survey in order to determine what's called the citizen voting age population, or we like to say CVAP for short. CVAP tells us how many people in an area are potentially eligible to register to vote. And then we look at actual voter file data. So the Secretary of State in every state has the responsibility of maintaining the voter file. That is the list of every single registered voter in that state. So we look at that list, we look at the number of Asian American registered voters on that list, and then we look at the CVAP, the citizen voting age population. And that tells us the gap. How many more people do we have to register to vote in order for us to close that gap? So ACS data is helpful, but what I really want to emphasize, Rajiv, is, as you mentioned, API Vote also conducts our own original research. We partner with another organization known as API Data and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, also based in Washington, D.C. And the three of our organizations partner on a biannual basis every other year to conduct what's called the Asian American Voters Survey. This is the only survey of its kind in the United States. And what we do is we survey a sample of Asian American voters across the country of various ethnicities, and we ask them questions about their party affiliation, their satisfaction levels with the current administration, and the policy issues that are important to them. According to our most recent Asian American Voters Survey, approximately 44% of Asian Americans identify as Democrat. About 23% identify as Republicans, and about 31% identify as independents or some other party. We are incredibly diverse in terms of our ethnic background, the languages that we speak, and generally speaking, among every ethnicity that we surveyed, a plurality of people identify as Democrats, except for the Chinese American and the Vietnamese American community. So this is really interesting. The two ethnic groups are not necessarily in conformity with the other groups. So 41% of Chinese American voters identify as independents or some other party, compared to 38% who identify as Democrats. So in the Chinese American community, there's actually more independents than they are Democrats, which I find to be interesting. In the Vietnamese American community, this is the only ethnic community that has a greater number of voters who identify as Republicans than Democrats, with about 38% of Vietnamese American voters reporting that they are Republican, 27% saying that they are Democrats, and about 34% who say that they are independent or are from some other party. So this is the kind of data that we collect in our original research on our community, because no other survey out there is asking members of our community specifically how they align in terms of their party affiliation.
This is a wonderful insight into the data that you just provided, which leads me to a thought. You used the word empower earlier. I want to understand, we've been talking about voters. Is there an aspect of API data empowering the candidates themselves? And if so, how do you take this data and how do you empower the candidates in addition to educating them about their own demographics?
One thing that I want to say about candidates is, according to API data, a record number of Asian Americans ran for office. In 2021, we saw a number of historic wins in big cities all around the country. I mean, everyone knows about Michelle Wu, the new mayor of Boston, the first woman and first person of color and first Asian American to ever hold that office. Aftab Purval, the new mayor of Cincinnati, Ohio, the first Asian American to hold that office, and Bruce Harrell, the new mayor of Seattle, Washington, the first Asian American and second African American to hold that office. There are a number of organizations out there who specifically focus on empowering candidates to run for office and to teach them and coach them through the skills that they need in order to succeed in their elections. And a couple of organizations that I want to shout out are, one, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, or APEX. They are absolutely wonderful. They do great leadership development work. I want to highlight Vote, Run, Lead, another really great leadership development organization. New American Leaders, an organization that trains up new Americans, that is former immigrants or former children of immigrants, to run for office. And these organizations have been instrumental in making sure that we are working actively to build our bench and to ensure that people in our community are not only voting, but they're also running for office. A lot of people don't know this, Rajiv, but when you vote, that's actually public knowledge. People are never going to know which candidate you actually voted for unless you tell them. But people can see whether or not you're a regular voter. And so when candidates design their plans for a campaign, they're going to prioritize people that they know are going to turn out to vote so that they can persuade them to vote for them. And I know this because apart from the work that I do at API Vote, I also work on political campaigns and independent expenditure campaigns and PACs and political action committees. So when I am working for a candidate and I'm trying to develop a plan for victory in that race, we're going to prioritize the people that we know are going to vote. That's the value too of nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations like API Vote.
That's a pretty unvarnished truth that you are giving us. And that is one thing I think I would want to personally relay as it is to our own community, which is this is how you are perceived. This is how you're seen. This is your value as a vote in the society. And I hope that cuts into apathy a little bit. My two key takeaways from this conversation have been that we're not a monolith. And number two, that there is a place for us. And in my interpretation, a growing place for us. Raymond, your story is very inspirational. The work you are doing is very encouraging, has personally motivated me quite a bit, given me insights that I definitely did not have. So thank you for sharing all those details with us. Thank you for inspiring us. And I wish you the best in everything you pursue.
Thank you, Rajiv.
Thank you, Rajiv and Raymond, for a fascinating interview that covered the extensive and effective efforts of API Vote. Raymond's analysis of the challenges of political engagement for the API community, including language proficiency and general apathy, revealed the significant and unquestionable progress recently made addressing those problems. Raymond also described the use of data obtained from the 2020 census and the resulting redistricting and reapportionment processes in advocating for fair, legitimate, and truly representative democracy and voting rights for not only Asian Americans, but all our citizens. API Vote's additional use of the American Community Survey and their own data from their American Voter Survey every 2 years is a huge and essential tool for existing API candidates in increasing their ability to win elections, as reflected in the record number of Asian Americans running for office in 2021 and the several high-profile victories they won last year. Lastly, Raymond's personal experience as an undocumented alien, musician, and social advocate participating in a Grammy Award-winning jazz album reflects the talent and commitment he and those at API Vote contributes to our community. We thank and commend them for doing so. Please join us next month when, on April 24th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we interview Dennis Wu and Joel Wong discussing SFCause, San Francisco Community Alliance for Unity, and their recently successful efforts in the San Francisco School Board recall election in February. It's been described as a great awakening politically of the Asian American community there and a formula that could be used in future elections across the country.
This is Dr. S.K. Low, President of Asian American Unity Coalition, or in short, AAUC. Thank you for listening to our AAUC podcast series on building our collective American dream. Please subscribe and comment on our podcast and tune in to our next podcast episode on the last Sunday of each month at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The AAUC podcast is supported by our active individual lifetime members and organization members. For more information about AAUC, please go to our website at asamunitycoalition.org.